He could not rest for long. Every moment spent in the wilderness reminded him of the darkness behind him. At last, the land began to change. Gared had crossed into the lands of men. Then riders found him. Gared offered little resistance. He was too exhausted to continue running. The guards bound him and took him into custody. To them, the mystery was simple. A deserter had been caught. Winterfell appeared ahead. The ancient stronghold of House Stark would become the place where Gared's journey ended. Inside the Stark stronghold, preparations were already being made for the law to be carried out. The ironwood stump stood waiting in the square, dark against the snow. People gathered quietly. To them, this was a familiar northern duty. Ned Stark did not enjoy the sentence, but he believed that justice demanded responsibility. Ice was the ancestral sword of House Stark, forged from Valyrian steel and large enough to command the attention of everyone who saw it. Bran watched closely. This was his first time witnessing the grim duty of his father. Robb watched as a young warrior would, seeing the execution as an act of justice. But Jon Snow looked beyond the sentence. He looked at the man. Gared's face showed no pride, only the exhaustion of a man who had been running from something far worse than death. Perhaps in his final moments, Gared remembered the darkness beyond the wall. Ned approached the stump. There was no anger in his face, only the solemn weight of duty. The square fell silent. Every eye turned toward the condemned man. Then ice rose into the air. Jon understood what Robb did not. Gared's courage had disappeared long before the sword was raised. The sword fell in a single decisive motion. Gared's long flight was over. The people slowly began to leave. Another sentence had been carried out. Ned Stark remained solemn. To him, the execution was not a victory, it was simply the law. Bran had questions. The world of the grown men was beginning to reveal itself to him, hard, cold, and full of difficult choices. Jon remained thoughtful. He could not forget the look in Gared's eyes. Far to the north, the Night's Watch continued its lonely duty. The wall still stood, ancient, immense, and seemingly eternal. But beyond it, the forest remained dark, and within that darkness, pale shapes moved silently through the snow. Those blue lights were not stars, they belonged to something moving beneath the ancient trees. The people of the realm looked south and worried about ordinary dangers. Almost no one looked north. The brothers of the Night's Watch continued their watch, unaware that their greatest enemy was returning. For generations, the Watch had guarded the wall against stories most men no longer believed. The wall had been built for a war that most of the realm now considered a legend, but legends have a way of returning when people stop believing in them. The others moved without banners, without horses, and without sound. They needed none of them. And behind those pale figures came another horror, the dead, no longer bound by the silence of the grave. Slowly, silently, the darkness began moving south. Meanwhile, the realm slept, fires burned in warm halls, and people believed the old stories were nothing more than stories. Gared had tried to warn them in the only way he could, but the realm heard only the words of a deserter. Gared was dead. His sentence was finished, but the darkness he had fled was not. Beyond the wall, the ancient enemy was moving again. The realm did not know it yet, but the long night had begun. Morning returned to Winterfell beneath a cold northern sky. The castle awakened as servants, soldiers, and stable hands began their daily duties. Everything seemed peaceful. Yet yesterday's execution had left behind a question no one could answer. What had truly frightened the ranger beyond the wall? Winterfell became busy with the sounds of another ordinary day. Horses stamped against the cold, guards changed shifts, and servants hurried through the courtyard. No one realized that the quiet life inside these ancient walls was about to become connected to dangers sleeping far beyond the north. Bran could not stop thinking about the man he had seen die. Gared had looked terrified, not merely afraid of punishment. Bran wondered what could have shattered a sworn brother of the Night's Watch so completely. The answer remained somewhere beyond the wall. Jon and Robb walked together through the courtyard. Robb accepted the execution as justice, but Jon remained troubled. He remembered Gared's frightened eyes. Something about the old ranger suggested that he had been running from something far more terrible than punishment. Jon looked toward the north, toward the distant wall. He had heard countless stories about what lay beyond it, but stories were easy to dismiss. Gared's fear made those stories feel different. For the first time, Jon wondered whether the old tales might contain something real. The northern wind rose again, sweeping through the frozen wilderness. Snow raced between the ancient trees, and the forest disappeared beneath swirling mist. Far beyond the wall, the darkness remained silent, but something unseen was moving through those frozen woods. Far ahead stood the wall, ancient and enormous. For generations, the Night's Watch had guarded its frozen heights. To the men who served there, the wall represented safety, yet beyond it lay a wilderness where old stories had never truly died. The haunted forest had become strangely quiet. No birds called from the branches, no animals moved beneath the trees. Only the wind disturbed the snow. Then, deep inside the mist, a faint blue glow appeared between the ancient trunks. For a brief moment, a pale figure stood among the trees. Its strange armor reflected the cold blue light. It made no sound and showed no fear. Then the mist closed around it, and the forest became empty once more. The old stories spoke of an enemy that had vanished thousands of years ago. Most men believed those stories belonged to another age, but beyond the wall, the ancient darkness was no longer merely a legend. Something had awakened. On the wall, a lone brother stood watch. He searched the endless forest for movement, but saw nothing unusual. The wilderness appeared empty. He could not know that the greatest danger was approaching silently beneath the trees. The sentry tightened his cloak and continued his watch. He had spent many nights staring into darkness. Most nights revealed nothing. Tonight seemed no different. Yet somewhere beyond his sight, strange figures were moving through the snow. Then the snow began to move strangely across the clearing. There was no visible traveler, no horse, and no animal, only a trail of disturbed snow slowly crossing the frozen ground. The armor was unlike anything forged by ordinary smiths. It seemed formed from frozen darkness, reflecting pale blue light as the figure moved. Its appearance belonged to no army known south of the wall. The pale warrior carried a strange blade that seemed almost transparent. It caught the moonlight with a cold blue shimmer. Nothing about it looked familiar, and nothing about the figure holding it suggested an ordinary enemy. Behind the pale figures came more shapes. They moved slowly across the snow, silent and unnatural. The frozen valley seemed to belong to them now, while the distant wall stood like a final barrier between darkness and the living. It was not a single creature moving through the wilderness. It was a gathering. Shapes followed the pale warriors across the snow, forming a silent host. No banners marked their purpose. No horns announced their arrival. The strange host continued south. Every step carried it closer to the wall. The distance was still great, but the direction was unmistakable. Whatever had awakened in the far north was no longer remaining in the wilderness. At last, the wall appeared in the distance. Its enormous surface rose above the wilderness, separating the frozen lands from the kingdoms beyond. For thousands of years, it had been a symbol of protection. Now, something ancient was approaching it. The frozen horizon stretched endlessly beneath the dying light. The wilderness appeared empty, yet the silence felt unnatural. Somewhere beyond those distant mountains, the ancient enemy was moving south, while the people of the realm remained unaware.